And welcome back to Coast. I'm George Norrie, and with us this hour, our science advisor and head of the EnterpriseMission.com and DarkMission.net, Richard C. Hoagland. Back from his successful Sci-Fi 2012 documentary, Richard's next on Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast, and here's a Coast ride. Richard C. Hoagland with us in the studios here in Albuquerque. Most of the time when I have you, you're on the phone, and all I have to do is hit a button, boop, and you're gone. I can't do that now. I'm stuck with you.
That's true.
You're here.
This is strange to sit across the desk from you. In Albuquerque.
Richard showed up
KOB.
with a tent, a sleeping bag, and he's been outside the studio, they tell me, for 4 days.
Did you ever think of a stand-up in Vegas?
Yeah, I did a long time ago.
Really?
Yeah.
Is there tape?
Thank God I have a long-term contract.
I was on the Carson show, and they destroyed the tape. So I
really?
cannot show. Yeah. It was
lots going on, Richard. My gosh.
Today, NASA had a big win, a huge win.
But you knew this. You knew this a long time ago.
Now, what's interesting is, they found the water. They found a lot of water.
Where is it?
Well, it's at the North and South Pole. There are these craters that are so deep, miles deep, that because the moon is almost up and down as it rotates around the Earth, they never see sunlight. So the floors of these craters have been super cooled for the standard line is billions and billions of years. But we think it's a little bit less, but still they do not see sunlight. So anything that's a vapor, like water, like methane, ammonia, even gases like nitrogen, argon, if they get in those dark craters, it is so cold. They measured from the LRO instruments, which is the orbiter, they are the coldest places in the solar system, colder than the surface of Pluto.
Even though the moon is only 93 million miles away.
Because they never see the sun.
That's amazing.
And the conduction, the heat soak through the moon is so low, meaning that the porosity must be very high, that there's very little energy that gets through other than by radiation, which is sunlight. And because they're in shadow permanently, they are like 20 or 30 degrees above absolute zero. They're the coldest known places in the solar system, and they're right next door.
It's all frozen water now, right?
It's all frozen everything.
How deep is it? Do we know?
We don't know.
Okay.
All we know is they
It's not like Europa.
No,
okay.
Not at all.
All right.
They flew this empty rocket, the Centaur upper stage, which carried the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter mission to the moon anyway, and they were very clever because for a few $1 million more, $79 million, which is, if anybody knows anything about NASA and the federal budget, $79 million is like coffee money for a week at the Pentagon. So for almost nothing, it sounds strange to say $79 million is nothing,
sure.
But for almost nothing, they got this piggyback ride with a design spacecraft called LaCrosse, which stands for Lunar Crater Sensing, et cetera, et cetera.
Reconnaissance.
Yeah, and built by Grumman, Northrop Grumman. And they flew along like piggyback until the last 4 minutes. They released the Centaur 9 hours before they got to the moon. That crashed. They used the instrumentation on the following satellite, which they called the shepherding spacecraft, elegant term, to look at the impact zone and to see what came up. And they had cameras, they had visible cameras, they had infrared cameras, they had spectrometers. And at the time, Robin and I were out in the backyard. Literally, I had to get her up because she'd taken a nap. And I got her up, put clothes on her, got her out in the patio.
You dress her, too?
When she's asleep,
oh,
I do.
Right.
Anyway, propelled her out the back door into the patio.
Too much information.
Gorgeous moonlight. And we looked with the telescope. I'd set up the telescope, chilled it down so it was, all environmentally proper so it wouldn't get, blurred. Nothing. Didn't see a thing.
You couldn't see it.
Came back in, watched NASA. They couldn't see anything.
They couldn't see anything.
And so for a month, there's been this, it's the biggest, it's like Al Capone's ball, right?
Mm-hmm.
Today, the principal investigator, Tony Colapreta, I think that's how he pronounces his name. I'm doing one of George Norrie's things. He'll never hear this anyway,
well,
right?
See, but you're not supposed to say, I think that's what he calls his name. You just name him whoever you want.
Okay. Anyway, I'd like to do Tony justice because he's come up with a really cool experiment. They announced today they had found water. And they hadn't found just a little bit of it. They found a lot of it. Now, to keep perspective here, when NASA made announcements a few months ago that they'd found water from the Indian satellite,
right,
Chandrayaan, it was like a little tiny film just
on the surface.
On the surface. Microns, which is a millionth of an inch, that kind of thing. This is like 25 or 30 gallons in a hole excavated a little bit bigger than the studio.
That's a lot of water.
If you extrapolate that to the surface of this crater, which was like 100 square miles, this one dark crater where it's been chilly for a long time, that's a huge amount of water. Now,
do they have that much water, though, in, let's say, the equator of the moon?
No, because,
they don't.
Well, because at the equator, you get sunlight. And during the daytime,
it's gone.
It's 250 degrees above zero. So if there was ever any water on the moon at the equator, it's long gone.
It's steamed off. And
it has migrated to the poles, where it gets into these dark craters and it gets trapped. It's like when you open your freezer. You see that frost on the side?
Yes.
That's because the atmosphere in the outside, in the kitchen or wherever you have your refrigerator, gets in there and cold traps on the surface of the freezer compartment. Think of that the freezer is roughly a few degrees below zero, right? Think of something which is almost 400 degrees below zero. How effective that would be at trapping any gas that wandered in there. It would be stuck forever. So what you need to do, if we're going to use it, you have to ship it out and heat it up, melt it, and then use it either as rocket fuel, oxygen to breathe. You could use it for drinking water.
Could you terraform the moon?
Well, it depends on how much. Remember, we're doing extrapolations from one data point.
Right.
We do know from two previous missions, Lunar Prospector, which was back in the 80s, and the current LRO mission, that there's a lot of suspect hydrogen hiding in these dark craters. The instrumentation, which is a neutron detector, could only detect the hydrogen. Well, hydrogen can be attached to anything. It can be attached to methane. It can be attached to complex organics. The amazing part about this story, the unsung part about this story, George, is that the water is only, you're going to hate me for this, the tip of the iceberg. Because what else they saw coming up in those spectral scans, which they showed and did not tabulate, they didn't tell us what the other molecules were.
What were they?
Is a witch's brew of organic compounds. And I'm suspecting strongly.
Life-generating compounds.
Or maybe compounds that were generated by life.
Good.
Now, they were, if you watch the press conference, and I'm sure our audience, some of them has a chance, you watch them dancing around this 800-pound gorilla in the room, mixing our metaphors madly. They didn't want to tell anybody what they think those organic compounds are.
Why?
Because they're very complex. They kept talking about, the spectra's so rich. There's so much data here. They've been chomping at this for a month, right? Now, if you know anything about astronomy and spectroscopy, you know that back in the 18th and 19th century, guys did this with telescopes and prisms and not even slide rules.
They did it by light.
They did it by hand.
Yeah.
And they came out with results. You're telling me that after a whole month of number crunching with the best computers our money can buy for NASA, that the only thing they could say after a month was, we got some water, but we don't even really know how much? No, there's a huge unsung story.
It's the only thing they wanted to say.
Precisely. So where is the area they don't want to go? Those organics. They said there were organics. They could be very complex organics, meaning compounds produced by living biology. Now remember, the standard model for all of this is that the moon has been desolate for 4 billion years. You've got these cold traps at the poles. You've got comets hitting the moon. We know there are organics in comets, at least simple organics like methane and ammonia and stuff like that. And they were thinking that they may get some of this stuff cold trapped in these dark craters like water ice. The fact that they're being so chary and not telling us what those organic compounds are